Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm here with a very special guest today, the head of the PF Topic Wording Committee, Bryce Piotrowski. So, thank you for coming on the channel, Bryce.
No problem. Happy to be here.
Could you give us a little introduction of who you are? What is your role in this community?
Sure. So my name is Bryce Piotrowski. For the past 5 years, I was the director of speech and debate at Seven Lakes High School, which is in Katy, Texas, outside of Houston. Before that, I coached PF in Lakeville, Minnesota. And starting next year, I'll be teaching history and coaching debate at St. Luke's School in New Canaan, Connecticut. Perhaps more relevant to this conversation. Last year, I was the chair of the NSDA's PF Wording Committee. So that basically just means I was responsible for coordinating and planning the meetings of a great group of volunteer coaches that are trying to write PF topics. And I had served on the wording committee for 3 years before that.
Dude, I'm so excited to be with you. I feel like I've been
Awesome.
trying to get in touch, well, not as actively as I could have, but I've been thinking about getting in touch with people from the wording committee forever.
For
So I'm
sure.
happy to make that dream a reality. So I have a lot of questions, obviously. So first question, very broadly, just how does the wording committee work?
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's a little bit of an opaque process. I don't fully understand what the process looked like before the NSCA initiated a wording committee. I've heard stories that they just kind of picked a topic and put it out, and that was it. But how the wording committee works is representatives from the National Speech and Debate Association, the office. They reach out to coaches based on recommendations from district chairs, from people that are active in the NSDA, to put together a group of people that they think would be good at writing topics, doing research to figure out what the topics should be. It's normally a group of about a dozen coaches, and the NSDA does a really good job of making sure that those coaches represent a wide array of geographic, like locations across the country, a wide array of styles, so that the topics can be kind of more truly representative of everyone. So they reach out to us. Our first meeting, my first meeting with the NSDA this year was in early March, and they basically say, "Hey, this is the timeline that we want topics to come out in. Please, go." Find some topics. Here's a spreadsheet of community feedback that we can provide to you. And then they really turn it over to the committee and let us kind of do our thing. So that's the NSDA side of things. For the past couple of years, the way the topic committee generally starts is we look at every single community suggestion. We go through the spreadsheet and we start getting an idea of if there are topics that the community really wants, if there is a topic area the community really wants to debate about, and sort of paring down topic options from what's suggested by the community. I think you'd be amazed at how much we kind of have to weed through to get to a list of topics that actually, make sense or is a starting point. But we start there, and then we start narrowing down, basically starting from well, here are like 40 or 50 things that could be topics. And then we write them, and then we kind of get that to a list of 30. Then that goes down eventually to kind of, I'd say, a list of 20 or 25. And then we try and set the final 14.
That makes sense.
So it's been 12 the past couple of years because the NSDA has let us um, pick the topics for the national tournament closer so that we're not writing topics for NSDA nationals over a year away. But that's pretty much how the process works at kind of 10,000 foot level.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I've seen a lot of people online kind of accuse the NSDA of being more manipulative or of trying to get the process to work a certain way. And they really do leave it up to the coaches, as at least that's been my experience. We have never had a topic that has been outright vetoed. We had to reword one topic a couple of years ago, based on NSDA review, but I've never experienced the NSDA being like, no, you can't talk about that or anything like that. So big props to them for that because I think that that freedom is something that is easily taken for granted.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't know how much you're allowed to say, but what was the topic that was reworded?
I don't. I think it was the topic that the NSDA preferred that we not use the phrase Middle East and instead use West Asia a couple of
Yeah.
years ago. So it didn't even materially affect the topic. It just was a, hey, Middle East is a term born in colonial discussions of West Asia, and scholars
Oh,
prefer we use West Asia.
that's
And we
crazy.
were like, yeah, that makes sense. But what ended up being interesting is how many top rounds actually did kind of end up
Yeah,
coming
yeah,
down
I was
to
gonna
like,
say.
is Afghanistan and West Asia, or things that are similar to that.
Yeah, that's crazy. So the NSDA literally ran the Middle East IVI. That's wild.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Dang. Okay, that's cool.
yeah.
You said that you usually like narrow the field from community feedback first and foremost. I was wondering, one, like how many topic suggestions do you actually get from people? Um,
Oh,
yeah.
uh, hundreds.
Dang.
We and I mean like legitimate topic suggestions. I would say, it's less than 100. There are a lot of people that like to troll with the topic suggestion, which is funny, but not something we're going to use. But we definitely do use. I wish I could pull a specific example, but we definitely use the community feedback in order to frame what we're working on, at least for this year. So for example, for this year, one of the common things that came up in the community suggested topics was sports betting, which is of course a topic option for February. We worked hard to find a resolution that would kind of work for that. So we do look at community feedback, and here is where I'll pitch. Like, if you want to be more involved, like when we send out the list of like, hey, what topics do you like? If you have any feedback, you should use that because we're definitely looking at it and discussing as it comes in.
Wow, that's interesting. So like if I really wanted a topic on the African Union and I like got 10 friends to all submit like African Union topics, there's like a good chance it would get on there.
I'm not going to say it's automatic, but and I also don't think that 10 friends would quite be enough. But I do think that if you got a lot of people together and you were like, hey, we think that we should be talking about the African Union, this year that probably wouldn't have happened because we just did AU Somaliland.
Sure.
But if you did something like that, yeah, there's a decent chance that you can influence,
Whoa.
at the very least, what we talk about. Like, it's a lot more democratic than people think. So
Yeah, that makes sense. And you were saying that you use the community feedback to sort of frame the discussions that happen in the topic committee. I was wondering,
yeah.
like, how many topics come in outside of the community feedback, or like, how does that framing work? Is it like an input, or is it like framing on the inputs that come from your brains?
So the discretion for topics ultimately is up to the committee.
Hmm.
So the community feedback we try to use as kind of the starting point for what are we looking at, what are we interested in, things like that. But we have plenty of topics that we write that are either very loosely based on community feedback, or something that's a little bit more like um hey, we have a lot of people that want to talk about sports betting, but like on balance the benefits of gambling outweigh the harms isn't a real topic, so we can't do that. Let's try to reword this and see if gambling or like the expansion of gambling is something that we can actually talk about. That kind of process is how a lot of topics end up getting worded.
Yeah, that makes sense. What goes into like what is the process like? Like how do you refine a topic into something that is debatable? Like what research are you doing and what things are you looking for?
The so I can only speak for myself. I'm guessing that like other committee members have their own process, but when I'm trying to figure out what goes into a good topic, I'm typically trying to find what um like in policy debate might be referred to as a solvency advocate,
Yeah.
or people that are actually writing about the recommended course of action that the affirmative would justify in both the direction of the ath and the neg. So that's also something that I think is important. A lot of people think of topics that would be really good to be ath on because they like the idea of the topic, and they struggle to realize that a good debate topic generally also has at least one or two kind of core neg contentions that work kind of no matter the direction the ath goes in. So it's really about trying to strike that balance, making sure that there's a good lit base that exists, and making sure that there's enough kind of flexibility in the topic to allow debaters to get a little bit creative with how they're wording things, the arguments that they're making throughout the year.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like how much ground in terms of breadth and also depth, how many people are actually writing about this on both sides, and then like
Right.
is it relatively balanced, I suppose.
Yeah, and the other factor is, of course, is the topic somewhat timely. So a good example actually is one of the topics that very nearly made our final list this year was the United States should establish universal compulsory voting.
Oh.
And the biggest reason that we ultimately got rid of that topic is because one, it was in LD a couple of years ago, but two, we were like, is there anything that's going to change between now and next year that will materially change the topic? And if the answer is no, we generally either try to reword it or we put it on the back burner, because, PF is, if you go back to its origins, it's meant to be debate about topics that are kind of ripped from the headlines that are a little bit smaller and that emphasize being able to, interrogate news of the day rather than more esoteric, evergreen sort of topics like either policy or LD. So that's kind of the unique way that we try to word PF topics to be more responsive to the headlines, the news that's going on. Because otherwise, PF loses a little bit of its luster compared to the other events, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned already an example of a topic that was sort of weeded out because it wasn't timely enough, or because you didn't
Mhm.
really envision things changing materially. Are there any other examples of topics that have been weeded out, maybe this cycle for other reasons, like because they didn't have enough balance or there wasn't solvency advocates or something?
Let me pull up my list here
Ooh.
to remember. So uh yeah, actually, we talked a lot about a topic in the DRC this year. We really wanted to make something work with the ongoing civil conflicts
Right.
that are happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we really liked the idea of that topic area.
Yeah.
The problem was MINUSCO is kind of slowly being phased out,
Mhm.
and it seems like everyone is kind of in agreement that something should probably happen and that the situation is bad. But there isn't really a lot of writing that exists as a legitimate, here's what's going to happen, in the face of, for example, the US kind of drawing down its foreign aid and foreign military intervention, UN funding being questionable. It's been really difficult to write topics this year, because a lot of what's being written about, just there's no real political will for that thing to happen. And the big difference between the debate world and the real world is that in the debate world, we generally talk about things that are unlikely to happen, but should, or should not. And the real world, people are generally writing about things that are at least somewhat likely to happen.
Right.
So trying to strike that balance is important. So yeah, we looked into MINUSCO. We looked into a variety of actors doing something to mitigate conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We didn't really want it to be something from the West because we thought that like that would functionally be like an American invasion of
Yeah.
the DRC, which we didn't want to have the AF defend, and we didn't think any multinational organization was really strong enough to make a dent. We found a lot of articles that were just like, the AU is pretty weak and is not going to really be able to do much in the DRC, that we thought AF teams were just going to really struggle with.
Yeah.
So that's probably the best example of a topic. We talked about that topic for like a few hours over the course of a couple of meetings, and it just didn't make the ballot.
Yeah.
That happens a lot.
It makes sense. I wrote my final paper for one of my classes in IR on MINUSCO. So
Mm,
it's a shame it wasn't picked, but I understand. Yeah, it's a bit of a
yeah.
difficult topic for lots of reasons.
I mean that means that you know more about it than me, but in the little bit that's the other thing that goes into writing a lot of these topics is like we have to consider a lot of stuff to write 12 good debatable topics. So sometimes there are, obviously things that we overlook or things that we are like, oh, we didn't realize this was going to be such a big deal on this topic. But by and large, the topics we end up writing are roughly 50-50. So we think
Yeah, that makes
that's
sense.
good enough.
What do you think is your favorite topic? That ideally like one that you've been influential in creating over the past few years.
Oh, the past few years?
Well, like however long you've been on the topic committee, you said 3 years, right?
Yeah, that's fair. To be honest, the years do kind of blend together.
Fair enough.
Um,
I won't make
let's
you pick
see.
one. If you want to like pick like I don't know, one
Uh,
that's in the top five or something, that's sufficient.
it's a good question. A lot of the topics this year, I was doing a lot more facilitating as the chair this year, and I was less pushing for individual topic options.
Right.
I can tell you that uh, I I have really liked the idea of us talking about corn for the past
Oh
couple of
yeah.
years,
I've seen
and
corn.
that topic being on the ballot last year. I did really push for that. I can't, like I said, I can't take any individual credit for any of these
Right.
topics. It's all a team effort. But I still think that uh, we chose the worst topic for the TOC last year, and I would
Very
have much rather talked about corn. But
corn.
I'm from the Midwest. I just think that topic touches a whole bunch of different areas. It touches environmental policy, it touches federal subsidies, and like economics, global hunger. It touches a whole bunch of stuff in a way that I think it's pretty rare for a lot of other topics to do.
Yeah, that
But
makes sense.
yeah, um,
We haven't had an
as
agriculture topic in a while, have we? I feel like the last one was like what, organic agriculture back in like
yeah, it,
2018 or 2019 or something.
yeah, so here's the other thing about writing topics. Um, there is a little bit of a thought of like there are some topic areas like agriculture that just if they're up against something else, they lose a lot of the time
Yeah.
because people are like I like they how a lot of people, I'm not going to say everyone, but how a lot of people vote for topics is they read the two topics and they go, "Oh, that one I like." And then they vote. Which is frustrating as someone that's writing the topics and is trying to, write uh topics as precisely as possible and do a lot of changes to wording, do we need to include this phrase, things like that, when a lot of people, especially a lot of the conversations I see online end up being like, ugh, corn, no. And that's like the extent of the
Yeah.
discussion, right? But it's okay, I understand, but it is something that we do have in the back of our minds.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that we as a debate community don't really debate at all about the topic.
I
As
know.
by and
It does feel like topic voting kind of flies under the radar, and then suddenly you're like, oh, this is what we all decided.
yeah, it's
So
interesting. What are some examples? So I feel like half of the job of the wording committee is after you've picked a topic, actually tweaking the words, and you were referencing this with like which phrases
yeah,
are important. I want to talk a lot about that. What are some examples, maybe even in this cycle of topics, of like recent changes in wording that happened that you think will have
Mhm.
important influences on how the topic is debated?
So we really what we're doing when we are writing the topics, the way that we write the topics is way more focused on clarity and very clear division of ground,
Hmm.
more than it's focused on, what do we want students to be debating about. Obviously, that's a part of it, but those things end up being a little bit um, more obvious.
Hmm.
Um, a good example actually is with the Europe topic. We really the one that a lot of camps are using this summer. We really, when we phrase that topic, we wanted to make it clear that the AF would be a break with the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So we kicked around a lot of different. I can't remember the precise wording anymore, but we kicked around a lot of different ways to word that topic. I know that one that we, thought of, never terribly seriously, but one was just like France should proliferate or France should expand its nuclear arsenal and just have like a French proliferation debate. But that wasn't quite like that didn't get at what we wanted the controversy of the topic to be about, which is really more about what America's role in uh, being the security guarantor of Europe and NATO would be.
Yeah.
So that the phrase at the end of the topic to create an independent deterrent capability really signals that the neg gets US based disadvantages as much as possible. At least that was the thinking for us, because the topic doesn't change too much if it's just the European Union should establish a nuclear sharing agreement with France. But if you don't modify it with the independent deterrent capability, then suddenly, you know, that you have teams that are like, well, the YAF creates a European nuclear framework that integrates with the US. And then it becomes very difficult to be neg in a creative way. You just have to be going for, prolif bad or kind of more generic criticisms of nuclear weapons.
Yeah. That
That
makes
gets into the weeds a little bit, but those are kind of the conversations we end up having is like, what do we want AF ground to be? What do we want neg ground to be? How do we word it in a way to make sure that like this is the clear kind of controversy area?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll definitely ask you way more questions about that Europe topic in a little bit.
For
Um,
sure.
a few more general questions before that. First, do you have any regrets about the specific wording of any recent topics after you saw them play out? Either like the
Oh,
set or the wording of the topic being a certain way.
I I feel like you're fishing a little bit. Honestly, I don't there isn't anything that immediately comes to mind. They like the other thing that I should say is like I'm doing a lot of comparison with topics that existed when I first started coaching or when I was in high school. So like I don't know if any of the really old heads remember the IoT topic from
Oh
like
yeah, I did.
November 2017, 2018, where the negative only got like your fridge is spying on you and the app was
Yeah.
like the internet is good. So that's kind of the that wording mistake, that topic, if I remember right, ended up being something like 58% AF
That makes sense.
across a lot of the major November tournaments
Didn't
because
it
it
have like
just like
it had a one-sided impact filter? There was like the benefits outweigh the harms to privacy or something.
yeah, it was the benefits of the Internet of Things outweigh the harms of decreased personal privacy.
Crazy.
And this is actually an example where like being on the wording committee, I can understand, whoever was writing that topic really wanted the it to be like something like resolved um to like this is something they wanted it to be a debate about personal privacy in your data,
Right.
right? Like it was meant to be like or do the benefits of giving up your data for these smart devices outweigh the harms to personal privacy? And it ended up just being like the AF was just like, well, smart devices have facilitated the spread of the internet, and that did a lot of good stuff. And it's like, yeah, obviously that's gonna be like, these kind of nebulous links to authoritarianism or like digital authoritarianism that just like didn't exist. So, um, Yeah, anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. But no, I don't think that there are any topics that I, have really deep burning regrets about. I will say a couple of years ago, actually, the way I'll answer this question is a couple of years ago, um, the February topic ended up being right to work.
Mhm.
In the United States, right to work laws, I think it was do more harm than good, do more good than harm, something like that. And I remember the other topic option that month was that the United States should pass and enact Warren's wealth tax. Um, and I remember when we were on the committee, we had a conversation about whether the topic should just be uh, there should be a wealth tax in the U.S. or the U.S. should enact a wealth tax, or whether we should specify a specific wealth tax. And I was very much on team specify a specific wealth tax. And right to work ended up winning. And my determination was that we thought that there were a lot of people that just like did not Google what wealth tax, what the provisions of the wealth tax were, and they were like, this debate seems too specific. So in hindsight, I kind of wish that topic would have just been the US should establish a wealth tax, because I think that topic is a lot better than right to work ended up being.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago. But I mean, as with a lot of these topics, this is not necessarily life or death work. The worst case scenario is, we have a topic that's a little bit substandard that we have to kind of work around for a month, and then we move on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So not to belittle the whole conversation, because I think like obviously what the topic is does matter, but there's nothing that was so one-sided or skewed that I was like, oh man, we really, really messed up. I think that the topics, by and large, the past couple of years have been really good.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I was not fishing with that question. Um, so I guess one question, a follow-up to that. Have there been any topics recently that you think some teams just like totally misunderstood what you were going for with the word?
Oh, totally misunderstood.
Like I gotta figure this has to happen sometimes where like a team just
It
like reads the topic wrong and you're like, nah, that's not what we
So
meant.
I know that it does happen. Again, I gotta look at the list of past topics in order to
Sure.
remember, because um I've got my list up of what we sent to the NSDA this year. But let me look at some of the options really quickly. Um or like the past topics
Yeah,
rather.
yeah, yeah. Oh man, now that I have you here, like I want to be so greedy with my questions. I have so like weird, funky interpretations that I had on past topics. I want to, test the legitimacy.
So I mean, most of them are probably, not things that we intended, but
Yeah,
that's not necessarily a bad thing,
yeah, yeah.
right? Like we aren't upset that people are getting creative. I actually like I don't think that people totally miss the point, but um or anything like that. But um the executive orders topic that we just had at nationals, I judged at nationals, and a big conversation that we had on the wording committee was a concern that the way that we worded the topic would end up being, um, because we knew that we wanted to talk about executive authority at the national tournament. Given everything that's going on with executive orders, we thought it was a really timely topic, and we thought it was really small in that. There's only really a couple of arguments for each side, but it would be a really good kind of controversy area to examine what role executive orders play in the federal government. Um, but there were some concerns about, the way we worded it. Would it end up being, the AF says the Emancipation Proclamation,
Yeah.
and the neg says Japanese internment, and then the judge like shrugs and picks one. I don't think that ended up happening. But I definitely did see some teams or hear about some teams at nationals who that like was their strategy. Like contention one was this executive order, contention two was this executive order. And in general, when we have these kind of on balance topics, we are more going for like the area using examples to supplement the kind of more logical warrants behind analysis of that thing.
Right.
Um,
I have a question
no,
about on balance.
honestly, I don't see any from the past couple of years that I've been involved with the wording committee that I thought that people like totally misread or did poorly
That makes sense.
or
That's
anything like that. Like
good.
in general, like the debates play out pretty much how we think they're going to.
Mhm.
Um, sometimes there's a argument that like either pops up in the interim, right? Because we're writing these topics often in March, April, May of the previous year. So for example, like there was a big discussion about whether in 2022 whether there would be a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan like during the national tournament. So, but yeah, what were you gonna ask? Sorry.
Yeah, I noticed that there are no on balance topics in the options for this cycle. I know that there's been a bit of a controversy about on balance topics in the community recently. I was wondering what your
Mhm.
take on that is.
I, I'm an on balance topic defender. I think that the reason that there are fewer of them is because really this cycle of topics, we tried to get a little bit more creative with the actor, and have we got a really good piece of feedback from a coach that I know pretty well that was like, I think PF is at its best when it's a very small focused topic that has a couple of clear delineations of ground. Um, so trying to get back to that would be good. Because we have had the past couple of years a couple of like really broad topics. I think back to like the United States' strategy of great power competition,
Yeah,
benefits
that's
outweigh
what you
harms.
say.
That
Yeah.
topic is huge. Like that's hedge good bad, right? Um, so we really tried to just word topics in a way that invited a smaller, kind of more focused debate in a lot of instances, rather than topics that allowed for like an absurd amount of flexibility. Um, Generally when we word a topic in an on balance sense, the tricky thing about wording something in an on balance topic is it generally needs to be balanced, and it is kind of difficult to come up with a topic that's large enough to survive a full month of debate, while simultaneously being balanced enough to survive just the on balance wording. I think executive orders is the kind of the example. There aren't any real like there's not a real lit base for getting rid of executive orders. A lot of the articles that people were pulling from to support especially the neg side of the topic were authors that argued that we need to rein in executive orders in some way. We need to limit they like where they're able to be used, things like that.
Yeah.
So that's typically how we like when we're wording something in an on balance sense. It's typically because there isn't a real solvency advocate, or the solvency is way too specific and would result in a very wordy topic that's based on like two articles. So the on balance topic wording really lends itself to a framing debate for what benefits or harms matter. Most AF teams on the executive orders topic really focused on kind of the functioning of government and it being a tool in the executive toolbox. And a lot of negative teams focused a lot more heavily on executive authority overreach and specific harms to precedent that have been accelerated by the Trump administration, but uh, perhaps started in prior administration. So we're really trying to get at that sort of like higher level discussion when we word things with on balance. I gotta say, I didn't realize that we didn't write any on balance topics for this cycle until you mentioned it. It's not like we're really just trying to write good topics, and I know that we kicked around on balance topics for this cycle. Actually, there is one which is the African Continental Free Trade Area.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
it doesn't say on balance, but it's resolved the benefits of the African Continental
Yeah.
Free Trade Area outweigh the harms. So we got one.
Okay, let's go. I too am an unbalanced defender. I feel like it makes sense for exactly the same reasons that you said, and possibly more as well. Um,
Hmm.
okay, a last general question before we maybe dive into Europe. This is a
Sure,
question more about like how PF debate works. I think it's valuable for my audience, but I want to hear your take. So
sure.
obviously we don't have plans or counterplans in PF. Even that
Hmm.
is becoming debatable these days. Um,
Right.
But sure, given that we don't have plans and counterplans, and given that there are probably multiple viable interpretations of any topic, because there's always some ambiguity of language, how do you
Hmm.
think that we should debate between likely implementations of a topic?
Yeah, that's a good question. My perspective on this is that uh, PF has always been a debate about kind of what the most likely implementation of the topic will be, or uh, you know, the NSDA rules, the language is something that's more like teams should provide generalized practicable solutions rather than specific plans or counterplans. That to me doesn't mean that, subsets of a topic are bad or not open for debate. It just means that it can't be the only thing that the AF defends, and they need to find an author saying like a substantial increase in this way would be good or would be bad. Um, so my advice for the viewing audience and the PF community in general is to rather than trying to avoid what the core controversy of the topic is, go to the middle of it, find what the most likely implementation of the topic is, and start from there and work outwards. Because I think that we you know I still have yet to really see widespread PF, reading a plan or a formal counter plan with a text. I have never seen a real debate over a permutation in public forum. I think that, perhaps PF is trending towards opening up some of those discussions. But I really do think that PF it needs to have this discussion in a way that is informed by some of the same conversations that have happened over the past couple of decades in policy and LD. But the fact is that because the negative can speak first, and because the speech times are so much shorter, I think that a lot of these discussions in PF need to be a little bit different than how they're kind of transported over from policy and LD.
Yeah,
So that's kind of a high level answer, but to be specific, I don't think that like on the Europe topic as an example, I think that the Europe topic says what the AF should defend, that there should be a nuclear sharing agreement with France. I don't think the AF can be like, we say that the implementation means that there is uh, like this specific change to the French nuclear arsenal. I think that they can find authors that make the argument that establish like this sort of nuclear sharing agreement would spur an expansion of France's nuclear arsenal, and they can talk generally about whether an expansion of France's nuclear arsenal would be good or bad. But I don't think that PF would lend itself particularly well to a detailed conversation about types of missiles or like specifically how the number of missiles or things like that, which I think are better served for formats of debate that have a little bit more time to get into those issues, specifically policy.
yeah.
So instead, I think PF needs to look at kind of the logical controversy area that exists, rather than relying too heavily on, most likely implementation is this, and therefore it's all that we can defend.
That makes sense. Interesting. So let's dig into that in the context of the Europe topic then, because
Hmm.
I'm fascinated by this discussion. So I actually think nuclear sharing agreement is quite an ambiguous term in the literature.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
especially in terms of when people talk about it in the literature, they typically talk about like examples of nuclear sharing agreements, but they typically do not talk about the lower limits of the definition, as in
Hmm.
what the margin of the definition of a nuclear sharing arrangement would be. So
Hmm.
my thought on the topic after doing a bit of reading is that, like, in all likelihood, the EU and France, for a number of reasons, are not going to agree on a very radical nuclear sharing agreement. So,
Hmm.
for example, like in the past, there have been nuclear sharing agreements between different countries that have literally shared like plutonium and nuclear warheads. Not going to
Yeah.
happen.
Right.
But that poses some issues because technically, some things that are very weak count as nuclear sharing agreements, and under this interpretation, they would be the most likely implementation. So I'm thinking like, for example, the weakest ones I can think of are like we just get Germany to switch up their jets so that if
Hmm.
there is war, we can offer them the potential of moving French warheads there in a wartime to then put them on the jets
Yeah.
to launch at Russia. We don't promise that it will happen, and we retain sole authority. An even weaker one is I was thinking about this today. Technically, the NATO's Article 5 is an agreement, but it is an agreement under very strict conditions, right? It's like if
Hmm.
your vital interests are threatened in this way, then there will be collective defense. So I was thinking like
Right.
an agreement between the EU and the France could even be conditionalized upon very narrow conditions. For example, like only if A, the country who is a potential host agrees to it, B, there's a referendum in that country with majority support, C, all of the EU members unanimously agree, D, France agrees to share in that political climate. And that might be circumstances that never happen while still setting up a hypothetical agreement that really doesn't do anything except for
Hmm.
sending a symbol. And unfortunately, I think based on the literature I've read, that seems like much more likely than some of these more radical versions of the nuclear sharing agreement that authors are actually writing about. So I was wondering, like,
Hmm.
what do you do with this conundrum where it seems like there's like logically speaking, it seems like the most likely way the topic would actually happen is this very diluted form of the topic that doesn't really seem like what the framers intended.
So I uh get framers intent, I think, is a tricky word, a tricky phrase. Um
Sure.
so this is where I kind of get back to the intent with writing this topic was much more to talk generally about what the US's role is in
Right.
the security of Europe and whether Europe should engage in that defense project more collaboratively within Europe, rather than relying more on the US. So all of these things were things that we discussed on the committee. We talked about whether we need to specifically defend that there was an expansion of French nuclear weapons. Do we need to identify how this nuclear sharing agreement is going to break down? Ultimately, what I found in being on the wording committee is you need to strike a balance between having the topic be open enough to allow for some of these discussions about most likely implementation, which I actually like. People complain about them a lot, but they end up making for what I think are interesting debates, right? um I think that like EU France nuclear sharing agreement, I think it's absolutely negative ground to say other EU states say no. And then the neg can have a discussion about to what extent the AF actually solves what the AF is talking about. Um, and I also think that you're correct that a lot of the lit ends up being more symbolic because, historically the European Union has been strictly an economic alliance and NATO has existed as the military alliance, right? So, what does it mean for the EU to take on more of a military role in Europe? Like what authority, like it's literally kind of breaking new ground on the role of the European Union.
Yeah.
A lot of those symbols that you're referring to, really, I would think of it more as like signaling or like the
Right.
role of these institutions. That actually is what I kind of think of as the core of the topic. That said, I think that there are going to be plenty of debates that talk about whether more European proliferation is good or bad. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that the fact that we have written a topic that permits discussions of whether expanded proliferation is good or bad, and also what the nature of that proliferation is, who is responsible for that proliferation, how different European states feel about that proliferation, I think makes for a diverse topic, and especially for the first topic cycle, this during the year, this is really a topic that has to survive 4 months of debate because
Yeah.
what's more than likely, historically, the past 10 years, the topic that has been debated at camp is ultimately the topic that ends up being debated in September, October. So that I think makes for a better topic. To one other thing that I want to speak to is about like this kind of tension. Um, that what you were talking about with like what is the most likely implementation, what is the framers intent. We have an idea of what we want debates to kind of look like and what controversies we want debates to focus on, but it's pretty rare where we see, at least for me, where I see a topic and I'm like, no, that's not what we talked about. So I think that as the topic goes on, at least based on historic trends, what we're probably going to see is most teams are going to start out having conversations that are kind of broadly, is proliferation good or bad? Is expanded European proliferation good or bad? Will it deter Russia? Kind of these sort of obvious directions of nuclear policy in Europe. And I think by October, what the best teams are going to be doing is to have a whole bunch of offense that's based on signaling and perception,
Yeah.
and to make the argument that like the solvency of the AF is actually probably more limited immediately, but what matters is the long-term perception of other states. But it generally takes the community a couple of months to kind of figure out those more signal-based arguments. So what you're describing as kind of a thorny complication in the topic, I actually think is what makes it a really good topic,
That makes
which I'm excited to debate about at camp.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I see that perspective. The only thing I worry about is the distribution of ground on signaling specifically. I think that there's probably
Hmm.
a decent amount of pro ground,
Hmm.
maybe. However, my current perception is that there's far more con ground. This might just be a lack of creativity on my part at this point. But like, yeah, my worry is that we get to this point in the topic where everyone realizes that it's not prolif, and then con starts farming wins.
Well, this is the thing that I think that teams are going to start realizing that a lot of it is about signaling. And then the pro really needs to lean harder into this most likely implementation stuff. The advantage of the pro is that, like, when you're writing the case or cases for the pro side of the topic, you have an infinite amount of prep time to determine what you think the most likely implementation is, whereas the negative has to kind of come up with how they're going to answer that on the fly in the debate. So even if your interpretation of what most likely implementation is either not directly borne out by the lit or is something that the neg should be able to answer, I think that the pro ends up being able to say, now hold on a minute, like a lot of this signal is going to spur, more regional security cooperation. It's going to lead to a diminished role of the U.S., which is good. These sorts of things that I think end up at least making debates even because the pro has a variety of directions to go, it,
Yeah, that's
that I think are at least reasonable. And again, like you can kind of play out the topic in your head, and what really ends up happening is the community figures it out. And as long as, we can have sort of these discussions, these are the same conversations that will play out in debates as well, right? So as long as, we have this kind of framework for a discussion set up with the topic, then I think the topic committee has done its job.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It is so true that like every time the community does figure it out, there's always arguments I never anticipated that become metas, that sort
Yeah.
of tend to rebalance the topic where it veers a bit.
And
Uh,
I can tell you in doing a lot of the topic prep and research for PFBC, there is way more Poland prolif evidence that our staff has cut
yeah,
that I didn't expect to be such a core part of, especially the AF side of the topic.
yeah, definitely.
I was way more focused on just kind of in general EU versus US. Should the EU be a military alliance? Like when we were talking about this on the wording committee. And as it turns out, it's like there's a really substantial base of lit about like whether Poland proliferates or not and what implications that has for European security. Like again, as long as that framework's set up, I'm less concerned about the topic's ability to like exist
Yeah.
and be a decent topic.
That makes sense. There's one thing that you said that I want to investigate a little bit, which is this idea that
Mhm.
the pro has a bit more freedom to sort of choose what they want to defend as the most likely implementation. Now, obviously, they have to
Mhm.
justify that. But you
Yeah.
were sort of implying that the con is reactive to that. That is not quite my perception of PF, given that the con can speak first. But I feel
Mhm.
like this demonstrates a subtle but maybe a fundamental difference in how we think about the burdens of each side in PF.
Yeah.
Um,
I actually really think that the burdens of each side in PF is a conversation that the community needs to have, and this is separate from the wording or topics sort of stuff. But I think it is relevant to modern PF. Um, I really think that a lot of the rounds that are being decided on arguments that aren't based in the topic in particular. I'm not saying that these things are good or bad. I honestly, I'm pretty ideologically neutral on a lot of what you might describe as like these sort of clash debates that have started happening in PF. Um, but I think the issue with them is that a lot of PF debaters are porting over strategies from
yes.
policy and LD that I
Yeah.
think are just kind of incoherent in a format where as Yusan can speak first. Um, and the way that I've been trying to explain this to the students that I coach over the past couple of years, and I don't know if the community has quite had a conversation about this yet or has figured out where we want to go. In policy and really now in LD where the AF is reading a plan, the burden of the negative is to disprove that the AF is desirable for a variety of reasons. Either the AF is worse than the status quo, the AF is worse than a competitive option, the AF isn't topical, whatever. In PF, in those other formats of debate, you would say like the AF has the burden of proof, the neg has the burden of rejoinder. The problem with that in PF is I think it was conceived as a format of debate where both sides have a burden of proof. In fact, to prove that their side of the resolution is true. So as a result, if neither team really has a burden of rejoinder, I think it begs the question of like why advocacies that do not affirm or negate the resolution as a statement of fact are voting issues. I'm not saying that they're not important or like they're not things that we should be discussing or talking about. And I had a team this year that won a bunch of rounds on a non-topical position that like we had these conversations during the year where I was like, okay, how are you going to answer this? Like, I understand the direction the community is taking this, but I think that this is kind of an important fundamental constant that I don't think the community really understands is as important as it is. But we'll see. I think that, as with everything debate theory related, it's going to play out over the next few years and we'll figure it out.
Yeah, you are preaching to the choir. I've been saying this to people for years now, and I feel like people just ignore this sometimes.
Yeah. I don't know. Like there there are maybe alternate ways of identifying what the like framework for the debate should be. But in a round where the negative speaks first and reads a topical case that negates the resolution as a statement of fact, and then the pro speaks second and says uh non-topical position, I don't really understand what the negative response to that can be other than framework. based on these types of arguments that are like neither side has a burden of rejoinder in public forum. Each side has the burden of proof. We're not saying that like the conversation that you're having isn't important, but it just does not affirm or negate the resolution as a statement of fact. And a lot of teams that are reading positions that aren't topical are reading arguments about the benefits of critical education or interrogating like the structures of debate as they exist in as they have existed for a long time, and not really offering an affirmative, like, here is our vision of how public forum should work. But again, I do want to emphasize, I don't think that that means that these arguments are good or bad, tenable, untenable, whatever. I just think that it's something that the community has kind of glossed over thinking about. Um, and we've kind of jumped straight to the like, is the discussion that is initiated by this position valuable or important to have, without really understanding, what is the alternative to this discussion that the team defending topical debate uh, is defending. Because I think a lot of teams are just defending, topical AFs in policy, and PF just isn't policy.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree with that. I feel like there's one challenge that I've had with this is the pushback that I've received against this kind of interpretation of how PF is different is that
Hmm.
perhaps debate is this unique game where we can use theory arguments to debate about how the game should work. So, for example, maybe you're right that PF
Hmm.
does not have a burden of proof for the pro or the affirmative, does not have a burden of rejoinder for the negative, but it ought to have a burden of proof for the affirmative. It ought to have a burden of rejoinder for the negative. It would be better for PF to turn into policy in this way. And that could be a debate that exists in the round. And that's kind of a,
I,
yeah.
I certainly think that that's a position, especially in rounds where the AF speaks first and the neg speaks second, and it's easier to kind of port these arguments in. I think that they make more sense. But if you're debating a team that is likely to read a position that isn't topical, I my recommendation would be to be AF speaking second or neg speaking first and read these framework arguments and be like, all of these arguments make sense in the context of policy debate. They do not make sense in the context of PF. Like, we were the neg, we spoke first, we read a topical case. Your interpretation means that we get 4 less speech minutes than you do. That's bad. Then you can have this conversation about like whether fairness matters or whatever. But I think that like in terms of the like structure, like the argument that these folks are making that PF should morph into a policy with a burden of proof for the AF and a burden of rejoinder for the neg only makes sense in a context where the affirmative is sidelocked to speak first. But at that point, like genuinely, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, my genuine like advice for those teams is you should probably be doing policy debate. It gives you double the speech time. You have one topic for the year that you can go more in depth on the lit base to make these arguments work. It's not because I think that these arguments don't belong in PF or whatever. It's because I think that a lot of teams that are reading these arguments would probably be better served by the format and the intense discussions that policy debate has had about this very topic for decades that PF is only starting to grapple with in any sort of way. Um, so anyway, a bit of a tangent from like the topics and wording committee, but as it relates to most likely implementation and AF flexibility, I think that the way that the AF gets to define things in, a traditional sense, the like topical debate. What I meant by that is if the AF, it seems like the community has been more willing to, if the AF has a piece of evidence that says a nuclear sharing agreement could look like this. I remember when I was doing PF, the first thing out of the negative's mouth in rebuttal would be that is not the most likely implementation of the topic. Like, they have found one card that says this, sure, but like it says it should happen, not that it would or is likely to happen. And judges just don't vote for that argument. So people have stopped making it. So I think that when I talk about AF flexibility, I'm more referring to a de facto
Right,
flexibility, like
right.
as it happens in round. Judges seem to be more open to just kind of deferring to what the evidence says
That's
rather
weird.
than
Huh.
rather than a like, hey, like, yeah, that your evidence says this should or like could be a way that this happens, but like that's not likely because like Germany says no or whatever other reason.
Yeah. Okay, this is deeply illogical. I am frustrated that this is becoming a de facto norm. I think we should change this.
Oh, I think it's existed for a long time. Like
Oh
I
no.
remember like that it like I think, really a couple of years ago, I remember being like, I don't really think that would happen. And my debaters started being like, but fiat means the AF says it can happen. And again, this gets back to kind of the burdens in PF discussion that we were having before in a world where each side just has the burden of proof to say that the resolution is true. I don't know if fiat and PF quite works in the same way that it
Yeah.
does in policy, and I don't think the community has had that conversation yet, and is instead just kind of porting over these concepts
Yeah.
in a way that I think requires additional examination.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
but we'll see. Like,
Community, we're gonna have this conversation. We're gonna have a referendum in PF on how PF works being different from policy and LD. We're gonna get
yeah,
our act
I good
together.
luck. Good luck. I don't know how successful that'll end up being, but anyway.
Yeah, we'll see. I do think that there's something to be said for like the strategic vulnerability of these arguments in PF. Like I don't know. Like if you and I agree,
Yeah,
and presumably I think a lot of other people that I've talked to agree with this as well, that these arguments don't make that much logical sense in PF, and people presumably are not very practiced at defending them. I think it is a strategic gap that exists that can be filled by
for
a
sure.
strategy that calls people out for this.
And I do think a lot of this is just that today's PF debaters have not spent enough time figuring out, how are we going to make this a winning strategy? Because
Yeah.
I'm more than willing to vote on like, yeah, this evidence says that this is a way a nuclear sharing agreement could have advocate for it to happen. It concedes it is unlikely, so there's no link. But like this is the other thing is just like it is increasingly common, I think, for judges to basically be like, yeah, you're winning this no link argument, but they have evidence, so it's like defense that I don't care about, which is just a way of evaluating rounds that I don't understand.
Yeah, I
Um,
understand that too.
I think that there's a little bit less um weight being given to defensive arguments in general, and that what this argument, this direction of argument, is one way in which I think that judges are a little bit less willing to vote on defense, which ends up giving the app more flexibility.
That makes sense. That's interesting. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll preempt this right now, just because I know there's going to be some comments on this video that are questioning this. Uh,
Sure.
we do still both agree that the pro has fiat power to say that the resolution happens in some form. The debate
Yes.
is like it does
Yeah.
not happen in
The
the form that your author says it happens in. It happens in the most likely form that it would happen in, which is something.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a line between the pro can only advocate for things that are likely to happen, and the pro can advocate for whatever it wants, provided there is one article that says that thing should happen, or even not, right? If the pro is just like, analytically this should happen, right? There's some line between those things that I think is where actual PF fiat is.
Mhm.
Um, that I don't think we've quite found yet. And in fact, so this is a real deep cut, but my senior year of high school, the September October topic was reparations,
Yeah.
and there were teams, me included, where the AF would just be three different forms of reparations, and then like functionally we would be reading like in like like we would be like contention one is like cash reparations, contention two is housing vouchers, contention three is like education. Here are three ways that the federal government could provide reparations to Black Americans. um that is not good for debate for obvious reasons. If the AF can just be like, here is a list of things that we will defend as examples of the resolution, then suddenly you're having like six
Oh no.
policy debates where each
Yeah.
side gets 40 seconds of speech time in the second half of the round. And like that is bad.
And
And
there's
I
like
don't
app
think
condo.
right. So this is the thing for like, and I think that these beliefs often align. There are people that believe that fiat should look like it does in policy, and also that the AF gets to defend what it wants. And if that's true in the current PF context, you end up with debates that look similar to that. And those debates are just less good. They're less in depth. The evidence is less good. It's not centered around one controversy. Instead, it's centered around a whole bunch of different controversies, right? An example would be like, and I probably shouldn't give too many ideas on the Europe topic, given that it's about to be debated, but it would be like if on the Europe topic, contention one was like nuclear sharing agreement means France proliferates and France prolif is good. Contention two is nuclear sharing agreement means that countries leave NATO and NATO is bad. And like there are a whole bunch of different things that exist that just end up not quite being like what we really want the topic to be about. So PF is in this weird kind of space with this balancing test that happens on a variety of topics and in a variety of different ways that, I think is probably going to get borne out over the next couple of years, as a lot of theoretical controversies are. But
Yeah,
it's
that makes
interesting.
sense. I still think, I mean, this is my personal opinion. I still think the most coherent way to settle on an implementation is just like, do we agree on what the topic means? And then within that bubble, what are the reasons why one implementation is more likely than another? If you win that debate, that's what is being debated.
Right.
It's sort of still very vague, but it's
Yeah, I think it is vague, but really, I think that it kind of gets back to PF teams need to have a firm defense of what their vision for the debate looks like, and this applies with rounds where teams are not defending the topic as well. Like, there's this kind of broader meta, like, what does it mean to be topical? What does it mean to affirm or negate the resolution in PF? But there's also like within a topic, like what does establishing a nuclear sharing agreement with France mean? And I remember like on topics like this, the meta used to be that you would like read a card in the constructive or the rebuttal that was like most likely implementation is this. This is what we will defend. And teams seem to not really be doing that anymore.
yeah,
Um,
that makes sense.
so, I think that if teams want to avoid kind of these debates going really wide and being frustrating to evaluate, judges need to start rewarding teams for being like, this is our defense of what this topic is. Here's our justification for why that's the case.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Okay, I just had a terrible thought. I don't want to investigate this too hard because it's a terrible thought. But unfortunately, it might be logically coherent. Given that PF is about the most likely implementation. So the
Yeah.
way that I sort of imagine it is like topic happens, we are more of a
Yeah.
third party looking in on the topic, sort of imagining what it would be like if the actor actually did this. So like if your Congress people actually voted yes on this bill, what do you think
Hmm.
the contents of the bill would be? Um, the terrible thought is like couldn't it be like an integral? Like you weight all of the different implementations by probability, and you have a bit of an epistemic humility effect going on where you're like, well,
Uh-huh.
there's like, there's a 10% chance that this is what the topic actually looks like, and that's enough to trigger our extinction scenario.
Yeah. Uh, that's an interesting thought. Um, the issue with it is I kind of think that what the implementation of the topic is, it feels like that ends up being evaluated in the same way a like interpretation in a theory debate would be. Like it is the
Right.
gateway to the rest of the debate,
Right, but
right?
it
If
does seem different though. Like I understand what you're getting at. Like topicality, for
yeah.
instance, like it's a clearly yes or no question. Is this topical? Is it not? But I do feel
Mhm.
like, and I guess it is kind of the same because it's the same gateway. It's like the base of
Exactly.
what we're debating in the first place. Hmm.
Right. So if an AF team was like the way this is going to happen is this, well, one, the more specific the AF or the neg get, the more susceptible they are to some kind of theory based in the NSDA rules, which I think too many teams have like hand woven it, like are waving away as like not a real argument. But I think like paired with the kind of burden of proof stuff that we were talking about earlier, I kind of think that needs to be the next development in PF theory. Um, but that's a different thing. The other thing is if the AF reads like, this is what we think the topic is going to look like, and it's like this specific, the more specific you get, the more reasonable it is for the neg to read other cards that are like, well, it might incorporate some of these scenarios, but you need all of them to win a link to your impact. So like the probability of your scenario is zero.
Right.
Now, the thing that is scarier the more that you consider that is I think that there is an increasing trend, like I mentioned earlier, of judges not voting on what they see as a defensive argument, right?
Yeah.
In a purely offense defense sense, the way that that argument is phrased is defense.
Right.
Like it says like the no link because this thing won't happen. But I think there are a lot of judges that are just simply unwilling to believe that there can be a piece of defense that is terminal in any sense. So in that sense, that does scare me. But that more has to do with kind of my complaints on how judges are viewing offense and defense rather than anything about what
Yeah,
what
yeah,
I think is how the topic is worded or what most
yeah.
likely implementation means.
That's fair. Very briefly, I consider myself one of those judges who doesn't really consider any defense truly terminal. Um,
Sure,
so perhaps we can get into this a tiny bit. Like,
sure.
why? I guess what is your thought on? Do you think I'm weighting the value of defense correctly?
Well, I think terminal defense exists because I think that logically speaking, right, there are some claims that are not true, right? I think that an assertion that is like terminal defense exists at least at its kind of like purest level asserts that there is a degree of truth to any claim. So if we start at that point,
Yeah.
right, it like the issue I have with that is I think that it then becomes impossible logically to disprove a claim that is like the sky is red
Yeah.
or pigs can fly, right? I think that it is sufficient, like, in order to defeat the argument pigs can fly, you can like cite a piece of evidence that says no, pigs cannot fly. And then that is terminal defense to that claim. Again, assuming if evenly debated, etc. Um, so the issue that I have with the no terminal defense camp is that it seems to be predicated on the assumption that both sides are making reasonable arguments and I need to weight them as relatively true or not true. And sometimes, like, even though on face some of the claims that are being made in debate rounds are not as patently ridiculous as pigs can fly, um they're close, right?
Yeah.
So and this I actually gets into kind of the broader. I think that the term judge intervention gets thrown around a lot. And I think that what people might be hearing me say is I am willing to intervene against bad arguments. And I don't think that's true. I think that it is easier to prove the validity of an argument that is based in more real world truth than a different argument that is not. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think that judges that are like terminal defense doesn't exist want to, as much as possible, take themselves out of the equation. But my call to judges would be that like there is to some extent that you are meant to be, the educator, the adjudicator of what arguments are constructed in a logically sound fashion.
Yeah.
So if there is an argument that like, you know, if you look at the flow, that it is, somewhat evenly debated, but one side is just like obviously patently untrue. I don't think it's judge intervention to be like, this was evenly debated and your argument is true. Pick better arguments. Like, but I think that a lot of teams, especially like a lot of PF teams, would hear me say that and be like, Bryce will intervene. And I'm like, I'm not intervening. I'm telling you your argument is bad, which I think is different.
Yeah, that's fair.
But
Honestly,
uh,
I think you've
you know that
convinced me.
that me being a little bit provocative also,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
I'm not saying that I'm willing to just be like, well, I read your evidence and it's wrong. That's not what I'm saying. That is judge intervention. That is a bad thing. But I don't think it's judge intervention to be like, you have made an argument that as a result of this nuclear sharing agreement, Poland proliferates and then exports nuclear technology because it's a new nuclear state to countries with no checks, which spawns runaway horizontal proliferation and nuclear war, which happens immediately because for whatever reason Russia gets involved, right? Like this is probably a disad that we're going to see at some point
Yeah.
on this topic or something
Almost.
similar to it. And I think that more app teams need to get comfortable being like, um, you know, Poland Poland prolif does not cause runaway prolif.
Yeah.
It's terminal defense. Like Poland, like there is no nuclear material that Poland has access to. Even if they did have this nuclear sharing agreement, like they would not have the authority to sell these nuclear weapons, therefore no link. I think that a lot of judges nowadays would hear that argument and be like, well, yeah, but it's defense. There's a risk of runaway horizontal proliferation, and any risk of extinction means that I vote neg. And I think that I and judges that are probably um, older than me as well are more willing to just be like, no, your evidence doesn't say runaway horizontal prolif. You're, Frankensteining a few things together. They've correctly called you out. There's no link. So, like, write a better contention.
That's interesting. Oh man, I think this is a bit of an ideological divide then. I was gonna say you've convinced me 'cause I do think what people call terminal defense does exist. My stupid counter arguments are like, oh yeah, your senses could be betraying you. Maybe pigs do actually fly. There's always a
Sure, sure.
but I
Like,
think in terms
maybe,
of
but
like
like, come on.
right, exactly. So, like the answer is just come on, right? Like the answer is that a
Yeah,
99.999% chance that something is false is sufficient to call a terminal. Um,
right. And
which
and that's the thing. If you as a judge are not willing to accept the equivalent of come on to an argument that is just like obviously fault, like we can run out any claim forever, and there is sure a minuscule chance of that claim being true, but I just don't think it's relevant to the round, right? Like if the neg has sufficiently proven that like this argument is patently false in every way, I'm not going to vote on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. My take is a little bit different, actually.
Hmm.
I think, for example, in the scenario that you just brought up, where like they say Poland doesn't have the authority to sell the nukes or whatever,
Sure.
and the other team says there's still a risk that it could happen even if they don't have the authority. I think the thing is the way that I logically analyze this, which is still interventionist, I guess, in the sense that some people might be complaining, it still does like my brain is still on and functioning, which
Hmm.
is what some people consider intervention, is that this has a risk of extinction, which mathematically might still be an important impact for me. And that realistically, there's two things that are important. One is that the risk is magnitudes lower than most people realize, even if the risk does
Hmm.
still exist. That doesn't mean that the argument goes away. In fact, I think the argument still, because of extinction calculus, has some weight to it. It's just magnitudes, orders of magnitude less than people realize because people, even though we underestimate big magnitude impacts, we also overestimate small probabilities. Um,
Hmm.
and the second problem is that the reason that this intuitively makes sense is because any argument that has this low probability of extinction, it does matter, but it probably means that all of your arguments have higher probability of extinction, and that the like integral of all of the possible downstream impacts of your argument, considering extinction, is probably a minuscule part of the utility of the impact, and that like the short-term
Right.
utility is probably much higher. And so like the
Yeah.
answer is yes, there is a risk. Yes, the risk is sufficient to create like a high disutility when you multiply it. But this is still not enough of a consideration to outweigh the other impacts that are in the round.
Right. And obviously, when we're talking about this, one contention, this one scenario, I'm presuming that like the neg also has an argument that is
Right, right.
offense that is better, right? But it seems like, and this also what you're describing here, like the way that you have started thinking through things, I think just lends greater weight to my kind of the core tenet of what I'm saying here, which is that to some extent, judge intervention is inevitable because all
Yeah.
of us perceive things in a different way, right? my argument would be to take that a step further and go, okay, given that everyone is going to perceive things in a slightly different way, obviously we shouldn't just reject arguments on face and like insert our own opinion into the quality of the argument's construction, etc., in the round. We should try to minimize the amount that we insert our own arguments into the round as much as possible. But insofar as an argument has been made by each side in the round, there are some arguments that require less argumentation to defeat sufficiently.
Yeah.
And I think that judges being willing to make decisions on that basis would probably be a good thing and lead to, better research being done because teams have to, fulfill a burden of proof to, borrow from an earlier phrase, right? Like if you have the burden to prove that your side of the resolution is true, and judges are being a little bit more discerning by being like, hey, like some of these arguments are just bad. I think that the quality of case construction in public forum would increase dramatically.
Yeah, 100%.
Um,
I think we are in
so,
agreement.
and I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. So to some extent, my clickbait title for that would be judge intervention is inevitable and good. But I don't think that means what a lot of people think it means. So feel
Yeah.
free to clip that out of context.
No, we completely see eye to eye on this. I think I've literally said word for word judge intervention is inevitable and good in the past, or like
Yeah,
necessary or something.
yeah. It,
'Cause it
it
is
just
true.
it's a fact of how debates get evaluated. Like unlike basketball, there is no objective measure for which team wins and loses. It's ultimately up to whoever's in the back of the round. So the way that I've been telling some of my students that it helps me to think about this is thinking in terms of the probability that one team is going to win a round, or like if you took a random sample of 100 or 1,000 judges, how many of those judges are you going to win based on how you did in that round? Like there are rounds that I see that like I think it's really clear that one side wins and the other side loses, but other judges I understand how they came to their decision and maybe the round is actually like a 70-30 one way or another. So there's always kind of this element of luck to who
Yeah,
ends up winning or losing a debate round depending on who is evaluating the round in the back and forth.
yeah. It's all just manipulating probability that you win. You can't ever
Yep.
guarantee. Okay,
Exactly.
so in the time that we have left, I want to jump back to the Europe topic,
Sure.
just for like maybe one or two last questions. So,
For sure.
um, I had maybe one more question about like wording stuff. Um, I
Hmm.
found it interesting that the EU is an actor in the resolution. It seems like that's kind of the angle of both topics a little bit, is like we want to have the
Yep.
EU be in it. But for this resolution in particular, I wonder what were you thinking of it looking like between the EU and France rather than like France bilaterally making agreements with Poland and Germany, etc.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is there is an obvious open question about the role of the United States and by extension NATO in the collective defense of Europe in the face of the ongoing conflict, the Russia's war in Ukraine. That exists, and I think that there are increasingly more people writing about like what does the second Trump administration's vision for America's security guarantees, defense agreements, what does that look like? Does it involve NATO? Is it something that the U.S. is going to start ignoring or minimizing? What does that sort of thing look like? Um, the second kind of avenue that we discussed with this is having the European Union be the actor in this topic in particular. And I mentioned this earlier, it shifts the European Union from purely an economic, kind of regional economic bloc into a military alliance that um, maybe not rivals NATO in the traditional sense, but because I don't think that Europe is intent on angling to be a rival with the U.S., but at least hedges against what some people are writing about with like NATO. Failing to act or really like uphold its collective defense discussions. And that's where the clause independent deterrent capability also comes in. We wanted to make clear that this was a debate about whether European countries should, without the US, uh, take a step to increase their collective defense in the face of an increased Russian threat and an increasingly isolationist United States.
Right.
That's kind of the direction of the topic, and that's ultimately why we settled on the EU. To address your point about bilateral agreements, the topic does recommend a bilateral agreement between the European Union and France. So all of the countries that you're talking about, Poland, Germany, they're EU member
Right.
states. So having the European Union enter into that agreement from a topic wording perspective allows us to kind of have conversations about all of these European countries that perhaps outweigh the European Union collectively, perhaps are an example of how the European Union would negotiate with France, but aren't necessarily the only things that we can talk about.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I think that is also smart for broadening the topic. Um,
Right.
I wonder if there will be any debates that are like bilateral France-Poland agreement is inevitable in the status quo. Alternative is to do it through the EU. Here are three reasons that's better or worse.
I certainly think that that's possible. Like I said, we're kind of just at the beginning of topic research here, and there are going to be
Right.
arguments that everyone is reading come October that we have no idea exist.
Yeah.
So I certainly think that that's possible. The issue with those arguments is that I think that the evidence that a nuclear sharing agreement between France and these other countries
Yeah.
is inevitable is probably power tagged.
Yeah.
So we'll see where the community decides to go, but I don't necessarily think that would be a bad direction for the topic if we're having a conversation about whether there should be kind of this collective European security guarantor of the European Union, whether that's better or worse than bilateral agreements. That seems like a reasonable direction for the topic controversy to go.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So independent means independent from the US.
Well, this is how I read the topic. Again, once we write the topics, they're out in the world. Like, I'm not saying that the way I'm reading the topic is right or wrong, and I can be
Yeah.
convinced of anything with sufficient, evidence. But the our intent in wording the topic was that it would be independent in that it was not dependent on any other actors, the ones that I think are obviously implied by the context around how the resolution is worded would be NATO and the United States.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then the last question, but I think a very fruitful question for my audience. What do you
Mhm.
think are going to be the most common pro and con arguments on this topic?
Okay, if you've skipped ahead through the rest of the video to get to what I think the best pro and con arguments are, you should go back and watch the whole thing. I think that we've had a
Yeah.
fun conversation. Also, I think the most common, so the first avenue of offense is going to obviously be proliferation. Does the EU France nuclear sharing agreement mean that France needs to develop more nuclear weapons? And would that hypothetical development be good or bad? I think that's kind of the first most obvious avenue of offense for both the pro and the con on this topic. I think the second avenue of offense that teams should start exploring is the role of the EU and whether Europe should create indigenous defense commitments or capabilities that operate independently from the US or NATO. I think there might even be some US backlash type arguments that, in a world where the EU creates an independent deterrent capability, I could see a Trump administration being like, yeah, so we're going to withdraw from NATO. Those sorts of arguments that get at like the structures of these security commitments in Europe, I think are the second avenue of offense. The last thing that I would recommend is topics about international treaties and other organizations. There is a lot of stuff about like global arms control that is touched on by this topic, like whether the EU's nuclear sharing agreement with France would perhaps violate the NPT, which a lot of EU member states are signatories to. What that means for international organizations. Are these international organizations actually good or bad? That's where I would begin research for both sides. I think that those are kind of the core controversy areas around, and you can group other arguments like Poland proliferation is probably a consequence of France proliferating or not proliferating. So those three kind of areas of analysis are where I would recommend the audience begins research.
That makes sense. Thank you very much for that on behalf of my audience.
Of
Um,
course.
cool. Are there any last things that you want to say about the wording committee, about the France topic specifically, or anything that we've touched upon?
Um, I will say that the complaint I see a lot about the wording committee is that it feels opaque. So I'm hoping that I've shed some light on how we think about things. Even if I'm not on the wording committee in the future, this is how a lot of the coaches broadly think about things. I do want to emphasize I've only been speaking for myself, right? I'm not an agent of the NSDA. I don't represent them in any way. This is just me, my experience on the wording committee, how I think about writing topics. Um, the thing that I would recommend is that you should get involved, and the more specific that you can word topics, and the more that you can specifically, identify pieces of evidence that advocate for one side or another, the more likely it is that your topic ends up on the ballot in some way. There are several topics on the ballot for the 25-26 year that were born out of ideas that we got from the community feedback. So the community feedback is actually quite important to the wording committee topic process. And as long as it's reasoned and clearly well thought out, we're going to listen to you. But if you submit the form with just a lot of like, I no nuclear weapons, this topic sucks, then we're probably less likely to uh, pay you as much mind as you think you would like us to.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well said. Well, thank you so much for bringing your expertise onto the channel and for
Of
meeting with me.
course.
I think we had a
Yeah.
great discussion. So I hope
Yeah.
the audience takes something away from this.
Sure
Uh,
thing. I am gonna use the little bit of time at the end of the video just to plug PFBC, if that's all right with you, Mac.
of course.
If you're interested in coming to a summer camp, PFBC, this year it's probably too late to sign up because camp starts in just a couple of days, as of time of recording. But we're gonna host camps into the future. If you thought this conversation was interesting and you'd like to have conversations with other staff that care about debate as much as we do, you're always welcome at PFBC. Website's publicforumboot.camp, or you can email us info at publicforumboot.camp. I co-direct the camp with Christian Vasquez of the Blake School, and we'd love to have you.
Yeah, lots of great staff can personally vouch. Wonderful camp. So go join, and I'll see everyone later. Okay.